Mr. President, I come to the floor today to speak about an effort to expand regulations that will have a damaging effect on thousands of Americans. For those who are concerned that this administration is trying to take away our guns, well, this regulation could actually do that. If this regulation is approved, when you decide to sell a gun, to sell a guitar, or anything else that contains an African elephant ivory, the government would actually take them away, even if you inherited the item or bought the item at a time when the sale of ivory was not illegal. In February, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced a plan to prohibit the interstate commerce of African elephant ivory. This was part of President Obama's national strategy for combating wildlife trade. Now, the plan's intended to stop the poaching of African elephants and to help preserve that species. But the impact will be something very different. The impact will be to change a policy that has been in place since 1990, which prevents the importation of ivory for commercial purposes, with the exception of antiques, but it did not restrict interstate or intrastate commerce of legal ivory. Now, let me be clear. I support stopping poachers. I support preserving these magnificent regal animals, the elephant. And I strongly support stopping the trade of illegal ivory. But what I don't support is treating Tennessee musicians, Tennessee antique shops, Tennessee firearm sellers like illegal ivory smugglers for selling legal ivory products, many of which are decades old, if not over 100 years old. Banning the buying and selling of products with ivory found in legally produced guitars, legally produced pianos, legally produced firearms could prohibit musicians from buying or selling instruments that contain ivory, prevent firearms and family heirlooms containing ivory from being sold, and pose a significant threat to antique businesses. Even though the ban hasn't yet gone into effect, the confusion and uncertainty created by the Fish and Wildlife Service's action to ban the interstate commerce of ivory and any item that contains ivory are already having a significant impact on businesses and families alike. Let me give you the example of John Case, who owns and operates a small family antique business with 4 employees in Knoxville, Tennessee, near my home. He says he could see his business devastated by this proposed regulation. This is what John Case says, quote, "The impact of President Obama's executive order expanding the buying and selling of antique ivory and other endangered species has been significant on our auction and appraisal business. If one looks at the number of antique objects we have sold," said John Case, "and are selling at auction, just for 2014, that total exceeds $156,000. The amount is more than 11% of our revenues for 2013 and does not include the number of antique objects we turned away from selling because of these new regulations and the loss of appraisals of those objects." John Case continues, "This would easily total an additional $25,000 in revenues. This total loss of revenues of $181,000 equates to 1 full-time salaried employee in addition to hours for part-time employees." Now, here's one more example of a new regulation that on a small business will equate to the loss of a job of 1 full-time salaried employee in addition to hours for part-time employees, and we wonder why the economic recovery has been worse than the Great Recession. You can't be pro-jobs if you're anti-business. If you keep dumping this big wet blanket of regulations on every effort that an entrepreneur has to create a new job. Americans who create jobs, one told me the other day in Tennessee, he said, "I'm sorry to say I'm beginning to look at a new employee as a liability instead of an asset." And he said, "I hate that. I want the employee to be an asset. But when I look at the employee, I think about what new costs does that employee bring to my business because of government regulations about Obamacare, about business, about this, about that, and now in John Case's case, about legal ivory. Mr. Case goes on to say, further, the loss of revenues for our business is significant as it encompasses a wide range of antique objects, including 18th and 19th century American portraits on ivory, music boxes and furniture with ivory inlay, silver tea services with ivory insulators, weapons with ivory grips and inlay. If these new regulations go into full effect, I anticipate the reduction of staff and intern programs, fewer jobs. The impact of these new regulations has a significant impact on our customers as well. According to Mr. Case, quote, I just fielded calls this past week of 2 local consignors who had holdings of antique ivory with values exceeding $200,000. For one of these consignors, his antique ivory was by far the most valuable personal property he owned. It had been inherited from his grandfather. For many of my consignors, said Mr. Case, like these gentlemen, they will see a complete devaluing of one of their greatest personal assets, unquote. Mr. Case isn't alone. The music industry, and we have a lot of that in Tennessee, in Nashville and Memphis and East Tennessee as well, the music industry is concerned. The National Association of Music Manufacturers, whose mission is to promote the pleasures and benefits of music, says of the proposed regulation, the problem with the Fish and Wildlife Service's plan, say the Music Association, is many post-1914 instruments containing ivory are still in use. For example, many famous artists perform with vintage guitars, violin bows, or pianos which contain small amounts of ivory. It's worth noting that the music products industry had generally stopped using ivory by the mid-1970s. A ban on the interstate sale of items containing ivory would prohibit musicians from buying or selling their instruments. Replacing ivory with other materials could adversely affect the tonal quality of those instruments. Instruments are not bought because they contain ivory, but because of their playing characteristics. The proposed ban has already resulted in anecdotal reports of Fish and Wildlife Service agents investigating piano transactions, piano transportation companies, to see if any instruments containing ivory, even though these companies do not own the instruments. Here's another example from the National Rifle Association about the proposed ban of legal ivory. The effects of the ivory ban, says the NRA, would be disastrous for American firearms owners and sportsmen, as well as anyone else who currently owns ivory. This means that shotguns that have an ivory bead or inlay, handguns with ivory grips, or even cleaning tools containing ivory would be illegal to sell. My office has heard from businesses and individuals from all different sectors of our economy, and the examples go on and on about this misguided policy. Let me repeat. I support stopping poachers. I support preserving these magnificent regal animals, the elephant. And I strongly support stopping the trade of illegal ivory. What I don't support is treating Tennessee musicians, antique owners, and gun owners like illegal ivory smugglers if they sell products that contain legal ivory. I call on the Fish and Wildlife Service to abandon their current efforts and take a more common sense approach, an approach that will preserve elephants while not turning law-abiding citizens and businesses into criminals. In the absence of a more common sense approach, I've introduced legislation, S 2587, the Lawful Ivory Protection Act of 2014, to stop this misguided policy from going forward. My bill simply stops the Fish and Wildlife Service from continuing down this unwise path. It keeps in place the same regulation that prohibited the illegal ivory trade regulation before February 25th, which is the date the Fish and Wildlife Service began rolling out new regulations to ban interstate commerce of ivory and any item that contains ivory. I urge my colleagues to take a look at this issue and to co-sponsor my bill, S 2587, the Lawful Ivory Protection Act of 2014, to stop the administration from taking away our legal guns, from taking away our legal guitars, and from taking away other legal items that contain legal ivory if we try to sell them. Mr. President, I yield the floor.